Cooking from scratch can be satisfying, especially in a homestead kitchen. But sometimes the time commitment can be overwhelming. What if there was a way to make cooking from scratch a joy and also save time in the kitchen? In this episode, we'll explore several strategies and tips to making saving time a breeze in a purposeful homestead kitchen. Let's get growing. Hello, and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. That's you. Don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant. Hello, fellow growers, and welcome to the Pray, Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in season 12, episode 9, we're going to go back into the kitchen because I really feel that the kitchen is the heart of the homestead. Sometimes we think that it is our home that is the heart of the homestead, but I think it's our kitchen. And it's important because when we want to provide healthy food for our family, it starts there. It starts in the kitchen. And usually it means that we're going to be changing up our cooking style to cooking from scratch or more cooking from scratch. But sometimes we feel overwhelmed, don't we? Cooking from scratch can take a lot of time. But today, I want to give you some tips about how you can save time while also cooking from scratch. These things are going to be ideas and tips that can help you do things a little quicker. The process of making bread, I'm going to be mentioning some things that can help you a little bit there, help it move a little smoother, or just things that help you think about cooking from scratch from a different point of view and more. Now, if you are going through the purposeful growing journey and you are in the purposeful kitchen stage, then this episode is for you. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Refining our skills a little bit in the kitchen so that we can think outside of the box and still cook good from scratch meals for our family so that we can make healthier decisions in the kitchen. The first tip is, you guessed it, plan ahead. Yes, I'm going to tell you to meal plan. You know that I love meal because this is the reason why. When we know ahead of time, we can take a little bit of stress out of cooking from scratch. When I know that I'm going to be making, there's another tip here also that's going to help you with meal planning. When we plan ahead and we think about what we're going to be making the day before, because we already know what we're going to be making, then I can get the meat out and it can defrost in the refrigerator overnight, which is the perfect place that a product of meat should be defrosting. That's where you're going to have the less chance of it spoiling and so much more. But when we're rushed and we don't plan ahead, then we're getting that meat out last minute like I did yesterday. I knew that I needed to be making meatloaf. I knew I needed to go down to the freezer and get out the hamburger, and I didn't. I didn't get it out till like 4 o'clock because stuff does come up. But if I would have had the hamburger defrosted, I could have avoided certain things that take time. Not only did I have to defrost the hamburger and wait for it, that took time. It took time out of my schedule. It extended the time that I would have been in the kitchen. Instead of being able to walk into the kitchen, my hamburger's already defrosted. Could have got my hands in that meatloaf, got it done, got it in the oven and ready for supper. So by planning ahead, we can do so many different things. We can make sure that our harvest is being utilized. I have plenty of blog posts and podcast episodes about that. We can make sure that we're thinking ahead and planning to get things out of the freezer ahead of time. Or we can do another tip that I'm going to be talking about, as in using a crock pot. You could be thinking about how you can save time in the kitchen when you plan ahead. The next tip I have for you is make double. If you know next week's going to be really busy and you are making something like a casserole this week where you have a little extra time, or you have one day of the week that you know you have a little extra time, then you could make double. Now, this is not going to save time on the day that you're doing this, but it's going to save lots of time on the day that you're really busy. So I could make double enchiladas, put them in the freezer, and save them for any time that I'm really busy. Or I can strategize and be like, well, I know that I'm I am cooking, the family's coming over, I could make a pot of chili and I can double that recipe, and anything that's left over, I can put in little containers, put that in the freezer. There's some amazing soup containers that you can get that measure out your soup so that you can get out exactly a bowl of frozen soup out and cook it later when you are home alone and you need something quick for lunch or you need something quick for dinner. You could just pull a couple more out. I like to do this also when I'm processing my vegetables and processing my food. Instead of just processing my tomatoes, I can make a chili sauce already. So I can put the beans in there, the tomatoes in there, the hamburger in there. It doesn't have all the fruits and the other vegetables that I might want to put in there depending on how I'm feeling for the day, but it has the basics. Another thing I do is I can think about maybe the way you do process your potatoes. Taking a lot of time to wash potatoes, peel potatoes, boil potatoes takes time. But if you were to can your potatoes, like I have done several times, you can make mashed potatoes very quickly. All you need to do is take out the jar, warm up the potatoes, and you have mashed potatoes. Our favorite way to eat them is you put them on a pan, put a little butter, a little bit of parsley, a little bit of salt and pepper, and you have roasted harvest potatoes. So by thinking in this way of not only just making double, but thinking of and tying in the planning ahead, you can make other ideas come to life in your kitchen that saves you time. When we think that we have to cook from scratch, I think this is a big hurdle, that when we come from grabbing a jar off of the grocery store shelves and we think we need to change to make our spaghetti sauce from scratch, we think that we still can't have that convenience. But the thing is, we can. Because what is separating you from that spaghetti sauce at the grocery store? You don't like the ingredients. You don't like what's in it. You think it's unhealthy. Well, then make your own. Make your own that you can still pull off the shelf so that you still have that convenience. Growing your own food and cooking from scratch can still come with convenience if you plan ahead for it. Now it is time for the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share a time and useful tip that I'm using right here at Red Ridge Farm that you could be using right now too. This week's tip is brought to you by the Planning Beyond the Harvest handbook. This handbook was designed to help you get your harvest onto your family's plates. We grow all this delicious food, and sometimes in the garden planning, we forget about the harvest and beyond the harvest. This workbook will walk you through the 5 steps that I use to get beyond the harvest. You can grab your copy at redridgefarm.org/resources. My tip for you this week is don't forget about your compost. Yes, it may be covered in snow. Yes, it may look like it's doing nothing out there, but it is. If you haven't gotten a lot of snow or you haven't gotten any warm temperatures where it has gotten a little bit of melt, you want to make sure that you've watered it and you want to make sure that you turn it. Even though it's winter, your compost still needs your tender, loving care. Those are microorganisms in there and they need you to take care of them. So take care of your compost this month. We are talking about cooking from scratch, and not only cooking from scratch, but finding some time-saving strategies and tips to help take the overwhelm away from cooking from scratch. We've talked about planning ahead, we've talked about making double. Now let's talk about investing in helpful appliances. Maybe this isn't something that you can do right away, but maybe you can gradually get into it. Maybe this is something you asked for Christmas. Isn't that just around the corner? Investing in a helpful appliance can help take and save time. Let me give you an example. For years, I wanted a bread machine. When I was first learning how to make bread, I just went with the boxes. This is for your bread machine. Make bread for your bread machine, and it's just the right size. And you can cook it through in your bread machine. Now, I thought a bread machine was very useful. I thought, oh, that would be great. But when it came to cooking in the bread machine, I just didn't like how it cooked my bread. I didn't like the size that it made the bread. There were so many things that I just didn't like about the bread machine. So now, years down the road, guess what? I don't use my bread machine for cooking my bread. I use it to knead my bread. So it takes that time away from me. I don't need to stand at the counter and knead my bread like I was doing when I didn't use a bread machine. A bread machine can be useful in so many other ways besides just cooking it. It can knead your bread. It can help you do things while you're doing other things. What I normally do is I take my bread recipe, and I have found bread recipes that work well with the bread maker, but I've also found some that don't take milk, which I really love, because sometimes not having the milk on hand, which I do have this our mini dairy, but having no milk in my bread makes it easier for me to freeze it for later, which is that planning ahead, right? So if I have a baking day, I will usually start my bread machine, get it going, and it's mixing the bread. Then while it's mixing the bread, I could be working on something else like the breakfast burritos that I'm making for the day. This is making ahead, planning ahead, because I do that for breakfast. Our breakfasts are usually very quick. My husband's usually out the door. The kids are trying to get school done, so I make breakfasts ahead so that we can just grab them out of the refrigerator or grab them out of the freezer and warm them up. But they're still made from scratch. A bread machine is a great and helpful appliance. Another helpful appliance that I use a lot is my food processor. I make my biscuits in my food processor. Instead of using the little butter cutter to cut in the butter, I do it in my food processor. I put the flour, the baking powder, the sugar, the cream of tartar, and then I buzz it a little bit. Then I cut up the butter into tablespoon sizes, put them in there, and it buzzes it together and cuts the butter right into the flour. Then all I need to do, because I make drop biscuits instead of where I roll them out, which you could roll them out still, is I pour the milk directly into the food processor, buzz it, and just slowly just add a little bit more of milk until it's the right consistency, and my biscuits are done. Then I just open the food processor and I have biscuits. They're still made from scratch, but I didn't have to take the time to cut in the butter myself. I didn't have to take the time to mix in the milk myself. I had an appliance that helped me. So I've cut down and I make biscuits a lot more because biscuits used to be a labor. That's another thing that happens when you're cooking from scratch, right? You think you need, especially on a weeknight, you want to get something done and you want to make biscuits and you're like, man, that's just going to take so much time. But if you have an appliance that can help you, that can cut the time. Let me think, what other appliance could you use? Well, I use a mixer, a stand-up mixer a lot. That really helps me knead breads that I can't knead in my food processor. So like my cinnamon roll recipe that is on the blog, and my no knead roll recipe and no knead bread recipe that is on the blog, I use my mixer, and it kneads it for the first, especially when it's all gooey and sticky and all the things, it kneads it for the first 10 to 15 minutes. And then after that, I have to knead it a little bit. I love kneading bread. It's so warm on your hands, especially those recipes that uses warm milk. But I take the time, I can be doing something else while that's still working in the background. So a standing mixer is a great addition to cooking from scratch. Also, pie crusts. I use my food processor for pie crusts. Making pumpkin pie mix, I use my food processor for that. I pour in the pumpkin, pour in all the other ingredients, mixes it all up for me, and then I can just pour it directly into my pie crusts. There's so many different appliances out there that can be helpful. Don't get overwhelmed with this step. Just try out one, maybe borrow one from a friend and see if it's even right for you. And speaking of appliances, and as I've mentioned before, another tip is to use a crock pot. What is a crock pot? Well, a crock pot, or even one of those pressure cookers, what are they called? I don't have this brand. I use a brand from Cuisinart, but it's an Instapot. That's another good appliance that you could be using. And this is one too, the crock pot. Both of them kind of on my homestead are intertwined, as in they're my crock pot. The one that I have can do crock pot things where it can cook a long time, but it also can do Instapot things where you're pressure cooking. And pressure cooking is a great way to save time, especially when you last minute decide, oh, I want a whole roast chicken. Usually a whole roast chicken takes about 2 hours in the oven, but in a Instapot, it can take, I think, 45 minutes to an hour. So that cuts your time in half, and that's from a frozen chicken. I put a frozen chicken in the Instapot, put it on for an hour, and it has it ready, and so I can piece it to put it in quesadillas or whatever I'm planning for the pieces of chicken. That's the best way to cook a whole chicken for piecing and taking it apart. I still love a good roasted chicken with the butter under the skin, baked in the oven. So good. But that's a Sunday night meal, right? But a crock pot can help with also the planning ahead. When you get up in the morning and you are thinking about supper and you want to make stew, well, you could easily make it in the crock pot. You could be putting in the ingredients in the crock pot in the morning when you have a little bit more time, set it on low, and then by supper time, you have supper, especially that night that you have to eat and run out the door and you don't have time to cook from scratch. Technically, you do. You have all day. This crock pot can do stuff all day long, and it can even do stuff all night long, like making overnight breakfast recipes. So crock pot is a huge asset in a homesteading kitchen, especially when you're cooking from scratch. There's so many different recipes that you can do in there. I've made jambalaya in my crock pot. I make pot roast in my crock pot because then it just saves up my stove for cooking other things, because I usually have family come over when we do a big pot roast. But also an Instapot. An Instapot does so many great things. I make broth with my Instapot. So I've just made a roast chicken, and now I have all these scraps and the bones, and I can throw that in the Instapot and make a nice broth that I can turn into chicken noodle soup or rice pilaf or all the things. And you can do, chicken broth, pork broth, any broth that you want, because you're using high pressure to really get all those nutrients out of the bones. An Instapot is great for making rice. Mine makes rice. Mine also makes yogurt. It just keeps the milk and culture at that right temperature, so I don't have to use my whole oven. There's so many things that an Instapot can be used for, especially if you get the right kind. I believe mine's a Cuisinart, and I stock up on them. When I see one on sale, I put it up in my storage downstairs. I'm on my second one. That's how much I use one. I think it's a staple on my counter every week. It at least gets pulled out every week, my Instapot or my crock pot. And now that my Instapot does my crock pot features, I don't use the old type of crock pot as much because it just encompasses so much. So I have one more tip for you, but right now it's time for the Growing with God segment of this episode, where you and I dive into the Bible and learn more about our Lord and Savior so that we can build that relationship with Him every day. We're going to be continuing our Faith in Action series. There's only a few more lessons here as we read through the Hebrews chapter 11. And today we're going to be reading Hebrews 11:30. It's a very short verse, but it has a lot of information in it when we go back and learn more about the story. Because remember, Hebrews 11 is called Faith in Action. The writer of Hebrews, I've told you that is Paul. It's actually unknown. The writers of Hebrews goes back into the other faith-driven people of the Bible back in the Old Testament and brings out their actions to show what they did by faith. And it encourages us to go beyond just belief, but to continue our faith journey so that we can be filled with the Lord here as we wait to be rejoined with Him. Because God asks us to do things. He asks us as a church. He asks us also as individuals to do things for Him or to let go of things for Him. And we've had a very good and deep series on these verses. We have just a few more. So let's get into Hebrews 11, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. Now, I'm not sure if you guys know this story, so we're going to jump back to Joshua. This is when Joshua now has the Israelites and they're going into the promised land God has given them. They've already spent 40 years in the desert wandering around. Moses has died, and now Joshua is taking them into the promised land. And he is told by God that God is going to help him conquer the people of this land so that the Israelites can have it. So let's jump to, this is going to be in 2 chapters of Joshua. It starts Joshua 5 in verse 13, and then it's going to go into 6. If you guys want the exact verses, you can jump into the show notes, which is in the link below in the description. Fall of Jericho. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. And when we go back to the verse, by faith the walls of Jericho fell. So by Joshua's faith, they fell because of him becoming, as he says here, what message does the Lord have for his servant? He is ready to serve the Lord. He is ready to listen to what he needs to do. He has an open heart. Let's get into Joshua 6. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the walls of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." That seems like a huge task, doesn't it? It seems like something that he's ready to fight, but God is just asking him to walk around and show his army to Jericho, to the people inside of Jericho. And not only is the army going to succeed, but the walls are going to fall by them just following God's plan. So in Joshua 6:6. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had spoken to the people, 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The army guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carried the 7 trumpets, went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpet kept sounding. So on the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are in with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking away of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to the destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and all the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men, women, children, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in, brought out Rahab the father and the mother, her brothers and sister, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into a treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. We are going to learn more about Rahab next segment of this series, but let's focus on Joshua here. Joshua was given the order to go into the land and take it for the Israelites. And they come to a big, huge city, Jericho. It has extremely tall walls. It is fortified. It is a place that would be very hard to conquer. But we see in 5 that Joshua is helped by a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword, and he says that he is the commander of the army of the Lord. And Joshua bends down in front of him and says, "I am the Lord's servant. Tell me what to do." And he gave him something to do, and it was probably something that he never even thought he needed to do. He was thinking he was going to be fighting a huge battle. I mean, that's what I would have been thinking. You see this big city, and I'm thinking, siege weapons and all the things that you would need to do to take the city. But that wasn't God's plan. God had a different plan to show his glory and to show that when you listen to me, things are going to work out because my plan is the best plan. They've been having this told to them for 40 years now. Their parents and their grandparents crossed the Red Sea, and God told them, I have a plan for you. Even when they crossed the Red Sea, we talked about that last week, they had doubt. They had worry, and that worry translated into 40 years because now they have spent 400 plus years in Egypt. They have not had the connection to God. The generations and generations have not had the connection. So with Moses, he showed them who he was, right? All the 12 plagues, they were to, one, show the Egyptians who God was and that Pharaoh was not going to be better than him and that he should let his people go. But he was also reintroducing himself to his people. And so now the people understand that they need to do God's plan. So how can we take these verses for ourselves? How can we eternalize them? How can we think about them and use them to show us God, right? Because as we go through our faith in action journey, he asks us to seek him. He asks us to know him. And he asks us to do things, commands, or different things that he might ask you personally. Like he personally asked me to be a teacher, and I struggled with that for years because I have great anxiety speaking in front of lots of people. And here I am, and yeah, I'm in my little bedroom and I'm talking to you, but I'm still talking to you. I don't have any shakes in my voice like I would have before. And that is all because I have followed the faith in action journey that God has put out there for me. And Joshua did the same. He had a faith in action journey that God asked him to do. He asked him to go out and conquer the promised land so that the Israelites could then be in the land of milk and honey. But they had to work for it. But he told them and he told Joshua that I have a plan for you. You may not understand the plan. Like I did not understand how God was going to use a shy introvert person to teach his word, to talk to others about growing food. But I followed his plan. I followed his steps. And there are so many things that have changed in my life that I want for you to see as well. When you step out on your faith and action journey, when you step out and do the things God has for you, for God's plan is always good. And Joshua saw that. He saw that God's plan was good, and he followed that plan to the T. Even though that plan may not have been what he thought it would be. I mean, circle the city with his army for 7 days. And on the seventh day, circle it 7 times. 7 is a very important number in the Bible. I won't get into that now, but it is a godly number. We see that he did what God asked of him to do. And there's other stories in the Bible where people don't do what God asked them to do. If we continue to read about the Israelites, and persons that are coming to my mind is Saul, the first kind of really big ruler of the Israelites. He didn't do what God asked him to do, and therefore he was no longer the ruler, and he made David the king. There's instances where God asks of us of something, but we don't do it because we don't make sense of it. We wonder why. And I think a lot of the Bible studies that we've been doing on this series has really been asking that question. Why is God asking you to do those things? And do we ask why, or do we just obey and trust? Because that's what faith is. It's that trust. It's going from belief that we know who God is. We know that Jesus is. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, so that whoever believes in him shall have eternal life." So when we believe in Jesus and we believe that what he did is what he did, that he came down, that he is God incarnate, that he came down to earth, he lived among us, he died for our sins, he was resurrected and rose again, and then ascended to heaven. When we believe that, then we are given salvation. And in that salvation, we are given our next piece, which is faith, that continuance, that trust, that continuance in trust in our Lord, and trust in what we believe. Trust in that what God says is truth. For Jesus also says, "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the light." And Joshua saw this. He saw that God was the truth, and he saw that what he needed to do, even though it was not his plan, even though it didn't make sense to him, it was the true plan. So this week, I want you to think about things that maybe God is asking of you or you are reading in the Bible, because that is very important. You are only going to find truth in one place. Sometimes we want to seek truth, maybe from my words or our human words, but the truth comes from Jesus. The truth comes from the Bible. The truth comes from God. That is the only truth. Oprah Winfrey says that we have our own truth, and that's not true, because the only truth, the overall truth of the world is that God is who He is, Jesus is who He is, and when we know Him and we understand Him and we seek Him and we try to live a life of actions that follow Him, that is our truth. Because the truth is Him. What is that plan that God has for you that you have been sidestepping because you don't understand it? Or what is that truth that you think is truth, but it's not? It's holding you back from truly knowing and being a part and finding God's peace. So I'm going to read our verse in Hebrews one more time. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith. What is your by faith journey? My last tip for you is a tip that I think can take all of these things together, but it's to build a well-stocked pantry. Now, I have a huge blog post about this topic. It goes into what you need to stock up on in the winter. And you stock up on things in the winter in the pantry areas because that's when the beans are coming in off the field. That's when the grocery stores are stocking up on those types of products. It's because that's when they're coming in the industry. That's when they're coming out of the field. That's when they're being stocked on the shelves. But a full pantry is beyond just your dry goods. A full pantry is when you're thinking about the meals that you like to cook ahead of time. And I think a lot of us, especially growers, think about growing a garden and growing the food we want to grow by like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to grow broccoli? Or wouldn't it be fun to grow meat chickens? But I wanted to remind you that you need to look at what you normally consume. Do you consume a lot of chicken? Sometimes we do because chicken is so inexpensive at the grocery store. But do you know how to process a whole chicken? And do you enjoy eating broccoli? Don't grow broccoli if you don't enjoy eating broccoli. Grow the things that you want to consume. And then maybe try one or two different produces every year to maybe get your kids enjoying broccoli. I did this a lot when I was, my husband and I were really contemplating if we should do meat chickens. Because when you go to a grocery store to buy chicken, you can buy all your legs separate, all your thighs separate, all your breasts separate. And my husband, he likes chicken breast meat. He likes the white meat a little bit more. So before we started growing our own, I would buy just chicken breasts to cook with. So I had to teach myself how to cook with the other parts. So where do you use thighs? What's a good recipe for legs? What's a good recipe for the whole chicken? Wings was our biggest hurdle, was like, what do you do with wings? We finally figured out a good buffalo ranch wings recipe, and the kids really enjoy that. But when you're first starting out and building that pantry and building and thinking ahead, you want to think about what you already consume, and you want to think about how you can utilize the whole animal, the whole broccoli plant, all of the things, so that those things don't go to waste. I know even still with us butchering our own chickens, I don't know what to do with the hearts, and I don't know what to do with the livers, and I don't know what to do with the gizzards and stuff. I do give a lot of that to my family because they enjoy those things, but I just don't cook them here on the homestead. And we struggled with the wings, like I told you, for years. I just didn't know what to do with the wings. We had so many wings backed up. Luckily, you can freeze things and it'll last a few years for you. When you stock up a good, well-rounded pantry, you're going to be able to take a little bit less time in doing certain things, because if you include things like spaghetti sauce that I've mentioned before, or your own canned beans, or your own canned potatoes, or your own canned chicken noodle soup, those are going to be time-saving implements. But also part of time saving in the kitchen is when we're meal planning, we need to have things on hand. Or when we decide what we're going to be cooking, it takes so much time away when we don't have to run to the grocery store for all the things. And we don't have to try to figure and scramble to get this. And, oh, honey, I need this. And he has to run and get it. And now you have to wait for him to get home before you can make supper. When you bring all of these things together with planning ahead, double cooking, and using appliances, using your crock pot, and utilizing a pantry and stocking up on things, you're going to be able to save so much time in just the decision making as well, because you already have these things already stocked up. When you're standing in the middle of your kitchen wondering what's for dinner, that takes time. And then the hurdle of cooking it from scratch takes even more time. So then you opt out of doing any of that stuff and you buy fast food or you resort back to your old ways. But by doing these little steps, especially the pantry, especially building up a pantry, it's such a huge asset and will take so much stress out of cooking from scratch and meal planning and all of the overwhelm that happens in the kitchen. I hope this little episode has been helpful to you. And if you want to dive more into this topic about building a pantry and thinking ahead and meal planning, I will put some links in the show notes below. But I do encourage you to go to the show notes, because in the show notes, I can share more than just in the little bit of words that they let me have below each podcast episode. Also, a great resource that I have that is free for you is the Planning Beyond the Harvest handbook. This handbook walks you through utilizing your harvest, but also walks you through some tips about cooking from scratch and saving time and so much more. So be sure to grab that. I will put the link in for that also in the show notes and the description below. But again, thank you for joining me here at the Pray Just Plant podcast. If you're new, welcome to the Red Ridge Farm Fellowship of Fellow Growers. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.